Henry Every, a captain betrayed by his own crew, leads his men in a rebellion to seize control of the ship. Their destination Madagascar, a land of opportunity and peril. But as they approach their goal, an unexpected challenge arises. What awaits them? The wake behind the English ship erupted with cannon fire, but the escape was too swift. In his quarters, one Captain Gibson arose from a sickly and drunken slumber, alarmed that the ship was moving for 6 months. The English crew of Gibson's Spanish-backed privateering expedition had suffered at anchor, awaiting documentation. Deprived of the meager wages they had been promised, Gibson staggered to the quarter-deck, finding at the helm his own first mate, Henry. Every Gibson demanded to know where the ship was headed, to which the bold Every replied, "I am the captain of the ship now, and this is my cabin. Therefore you must walk out. I am bound to Madagascar, with a design of making my own fortune, and that of all the brave fellows joined with me." Honest sailing had promised the crew long and oppressive voyages for paltry food and wages, and so sending Gibson and 16 others away in a small boat. Every and 80 mutinous associates set a course for Madagascar, where ordinary men of their lot might seize their fortune with sword and pistol. Indeed, a fellow Englishman named Thomas too had ventured there and built his legend plundering the treasures of the Indian Ocean, rechristening their ship the Fancy. The pirates sailed first to the tropical waters of Cape Verde to procure provisions there. Captain Every raided 3 English merchant vessels for salt beef and fish and presented to their impoverished crews in apparently egalitarian arrangement. If they joined him, pirate code stipulated their loot should be divided in clear and fairly equal structures, and unjust captains could be voted out. Every own power was checked by that of his quartermaster, Joseph Dawson. 9 of the English sailors came aboard, and soon the pirates cruised into the turquoise waters of West Africa. Captain Every knew this so-called slave coast well. After a stint in the Royal Navy, he had made a living here, purchasing people from African chiefs, and often stealing those slave traders as well. Men and women had begged for mercy, as Every shackled them below deck to starve and wallow in their own waste. Months later, he would haul out the survivors to be sold and to suffer the rest of their lives on plantations in the West Indies. Now Henry Every returned to this coast under different pretenses. He raised the English flag at a verdant harbour, and a group of Guinean villagers soon paddled out and came aboard to trade. The pirates robbed them of their gold, placed them in chains and stole them all into slavery. The crew continued south, stopping to remove extraneous decks from the ship, such that the Fancy became one of the fastest vessels on the Atlantic with newfound speed. Every chased down 2 Danish privateering ships, and let loose a violent torrent of cannon fire. The Danes surrendered and relinquished 40 pounds of gold, chests of fine fabrics, ivory and guns, and 50 large casks of brandy. 17 privateers joined the crew. Now months into the journey, the Fancy reached cool winds which carried her past pods of breaching whales and around the Cape of Good Hope, and the crew at long last spotted a distant and friendly harbour. The shores of Madagascar were host to seafaring colonies of thieves and killers, pirate dens. The men found their land legs ashore, merrily gorging themselves on the stolen brandy. The crew explored clicking jungles in the coming months, and encountered Malagasy natives who traded them cattle for guns. There was risk in venturing far from these shores, for England's East India Company patrolled these seas. Its well-armed ships annually delivered England to fortune and tea, textiles and spices from Indonesia, China, Persia, and the great Mughal Empire of India. Exponential profits lined the petticoat pockets of English nobles, such that the East India Company became at once a private trade monopoly and a veritable nation-state acting on behalf of the King of England, violently claiming foreign territory, with its own mercenary army and navy. Threats to company trade from competitors or pirates would be punished. 3 company ships caught sight of the wanted Fancy after Every had raided a French pirate ship and recruited 40 of her crew. They gave chase, but they reported that the modified Fancy sails so hard now that she fears not who follows her. This ship will undoubtedly go into the Red Sea, which will procure infinite clamours in India. Indeed, from the mouth of the Red Sea, a pilgrim fleet was to return from Mecca, laden with treasures and concubines from the Islamic world, bound for India, whose elegant ruling classes adorned themselves with gemstones and gold. The largest and most prized vessel in the convoy belonged to the Mughal Emperor himself, Aurangzeb, and it was called the Ganges Sawai, or the gun sway rounding the Horn of Africa. Every sailed to the port of Maid Somalia. The locals rebuffed his offers to trade, so the pirates set fire to the town. Civilians scattered, and it was recorded that every took revenge by demolishing their sacred mosque. He proceeded to the volcanic island of Perm in August of 1695 to await the Mughal treasure fleet, where he discovered 5 other pirate crews had arrived with the same intentions. At the helm of one ship called Amity was the legend himself, Thomas II. The captains convened in a boisterous pirate council, whereupon they pledged to honour Henry Every as the captain of a combined pirate fleet. 6 ships and over 400 men. Nightfall provided cover for the Mughal fleet, and the convoy snuck into the open ocean. But its most fearsome and treasure-laden ships, the Fate Mohammed, in the gun sway, still lagged behind the pirates, gave chase. Thomas II raised the black flag against the Fate Mohammed, but the Mughals fired back. A cannonball tore across his abdomen, his innards spilled into his own hands, and he collapsed dead. The Fate Mohammed imprisoned some of his crew and sailed on until a few nights later. A black form appeared up ahead. The Fancy opened fire on the Fate Mohammed, and after some resistance, the Mughals surrendered. Every freed its prisoners and plundered its treasure. But the True Fortune, the gun sway, still sailed ahead. The pirates surged at full sail in pursuit aboard the gun sway. The Mughals caught sight of the smaller Fancy. They outnumbered the pirate crew nearly 5 to 1 and possessed twice the number of cannons. Still Every could not resist. He shouted for a broadside attack. The gun sway absorbed the volley. The Mughals prepared to return fire, but one of their cannons malfunctioned and exploded. Mangled gunners were pulled from the flames as Mughals scrambled on the main deck. Every launched another volley, and one fateful cannonball struck the main mast of the gun sway. The rigging toppled and splintered as every ships pulled closer. Pirates began to scale the gun sway from all sides. They charged through desperate plumes of gun smoke and wildly locked swords with illegal defenders. After hours of battle, the gun sway capitulated. Every watched his pirates burn and torture Indian sailors until they confessed to the location of all the treasure hidden aboard. Gaping corpses decorated the bleeding deck, and there wailed the female pilgrims upon whom the pirates forced themselves again and again for days. Several women slit their own throats or drowned themselves to avoid the same depravity. Tons of shining emeralds, Arabian gold, ivory and silk were carried proudly from the scene of this slaughter to the Fancy. This was perhaps the most valuable treasure ever stolen. Every took his massive share, and Quartermaster Dawson divided the remainder over a lifetime of sailors' wages for each man. The defiled gun sway returned to port some days after the attack. The Mughals demanded justice and blamed the East India Company for the plague of English pirates in their seas. Seeking to preserve commercial interests, England and the company sought to capture Every and absolve themselves of guilt, but he was lost to the open seas. The pirates stopped briefly to purchase 90 slaves near Madagascar, and later to hunt sea turtles before traversing the Atlantic. 7 months later the Fancy sailed into the quiet backwater bay of Nassau. Every posed as a slave trader, and bribed the governor with chests of gold and the Fancy itself in exchange for safe hiding. 4 weeks the pirates exchanged coin for rum in the decrepit taverns of Nassau. But in due time proclamations from the Lords Justices of England spread across the seas. We do hereby charge command all His Majesties, admirals, captains and other officers at sea to seize and take Henry Every, and such as are with him on the ship to be punished as pirates. Upon the high seas an enormous bounty was set and the crew of the Fancy disbanded. Some stayed in Nassau, most headed for corrupt parts of the 13 colonies, and Captain Every purchased a small ship with some of his men and returned to sea. It was later said that in the green fields of Ireland, every bloke from his crew told some he was going on to Scotland alone. Others he told England the fate of Henry. Every became, in the coming years, a tale told on pirate decks, a sailor's story belted in shanty taverns, or scrawled in the dubious pages of popular books. Some said every squandered his wealth, or that he eloped with a Mughal princess, or that he now governed a free colony of pirates on Madagascar. Evidence for his whereabouts never came. The same year every disappeared. Joseph Dawson and a handful of the crew, who had returned to Britain, were paraded to execution dock in London to answer for their crimes. Before the gallows, one of the pirates told the eager crowds that the crew deserved death, and that the inhuman treatment and merciless tortures inflicted on the poor Indians in their women still affects my soul. It appeared to some that in their slaving and murder and molestation of innocents, the pirates had not betrayed some heroic code, but rather exposed those very bloated professions of libertine spirit as tawdry platitude, maritime atrocities styled as plucky resistance. They were all hanged slowly, strangled on short nooses. Their corpses were left to dangle in the tide, and wither into ghoulish forms on the grey coast, and elsewhere in some unseen corner of the world was Henry Every, and his share of the treasure never found. Question: how did violent fugitives like Henry Every and Blackbeard become known as romantic heroes, adventurers? The documentary Pirates from Magellan TV helped answer that question. For me, it's part of their Britain's Outlaws series that really shows how those swashbuckling elements of gold cannons and murder captivated and appalled people at that time too. I always loved to actually see what the places and weapons and so on look like of an era, and this documentary really delivered. To go watch it for free. Join the crew and dive deeper into the pirates' world. Subscribe now to get notified when we set sail for more adventures with Henry Every.